Picture this. You wake up one morning to find your entire world has become an ocean. Not the romantic azure kind from vacation postcards, but a churning brown nightmare that stretches beyond every horizon, swallowing cities, villages, and entire provinces as if they were mere stone castles. Welcome to China, 1931, where Mother Nature decided to write the most devastating chapter in human history using nothing but water, mud, and absolute chaos. Tonight, we're exploring the catastrophic floods that turned the heart of China into a temporary sea larger than England, claiming more lives than both world wars combined. So dim those lights, maybe turn on a gentle fan for some ambient sound, and settle in as we journey back to witness humanity's most devastating encounter with the raw, unstoppable power of nature. But first, let me ask you this. Do you really think you could survive when an entire river system decides to rewrite geography itself? The reality of surviving the 1931 China floods. You are a rice farmer in Hubei province, central China. It's July 1931, and what started as unusually heavy rains 3 months ago has become something that doesn't even have a proper name yet. The locals are calling it the Great Water. But that feels almost quaint compared to the apocalyptic reality surrounding you. Your day begins before dawn, not by choice, but because the sound of rushing water never stops anymore. It's a constant, maddening roar that has replaced the familiar sounds of roosters crowing and children playing. You've been sleeping in shifts with your family for weeks now. Someone always awake to listen for changes in the water's voice, because that voice tells you whether you'll live through another day. The first thing you notice when you wake is that your feet are wet. Again. The bamboo platform bed you hastily constructed 2 weeks ago, thinking it would keep you safe, is now partially submerged. The water level rose another 6 inches overnight. You realize with growing horror that this crude shelter, built in what used to be the highest room of your house, might not last another day. Looking out through the gap where your roof used to meet the walls, before the timbers swollen with moisture finally gave way, you see a landscape that belongs in nightmares. Where your village once stood, where you were born, where your parents are buried, where your children took their first steps, there is now an endless brown sea dotted with debris that tells the story of destroyed lives. A wooden cartwheel spins slowly in an eddy. A child's shoe floats past. Most disturbing of all, the bodies of livestock bob in the distance, their bloated forms a constant reminder of death's proximity. The smell is what really gets to you, though. It's not just the musty dampness you might expect from flooding. It's the sweet, cloying stench of decomposition mixed with human waste. Rotting crops and industrial chemicals from the factories of river. The smell clings to everything, seeps into your clothes, your hair, your skin. Even when you manage to find relatively clean water to drink, you can still taste it. It coats the back of your throat and makes every meal an exercise in fighting down nausea. Food. That's your constant obsession now. Your rice stores, your vegetables, your chickens, everything you've worked for your entire life. All of it lies beneath 20 feet of contaminated water. You've been surviving on whatever you can scavenge from floating debris, sharing moldy grain with rats, and occasionally catching fish with your bare hands, though you try not to think too hard about what these fish have been feeding on. Yesterday, you watched your neighbor try to retrieve a sack of rice that had floated within reach of his makeshift raft. The current was stronger than it looked. Within seconds, he was gone, swept away faster than anyone could react. His wife's screams still echo in your mind. There was nothing anyone could do. In this new reality, reaching for salvation often means grabbing hold of death instead. The cold is another killer. Even though it's summer, The constant dampness chills you to your bones. Your clothes haven't been dry in over a month. Everything is perpetually soggy, breeding grounds for infections and disease. The minor cut on your hand from building the shelter platform has turned into something angry and festering. You have no medicine, no clean bandages, and you know that in this environment, even small wounds can become death sentences. Sleep, when it comes at all, is fitful and dangerous. You dream of dry land, of warm meals, of your lost animals. But you also dream of the water rising, of waking up drowning. Sometimes you're not sure which is the dream and which is reality. The boundary between sleeping and waking has blurred into a grey area of constant vigilance and exhaustion. Your children, if they've survived this long, are changing in ways that break your heart. They've stopped asking when they can go home, stopped talking about their friends who disappeared. They've developed the hollow, watchful eyes of people who've seen too much death. Your youngest, barely 6 years old, now talks matter-of-factly about which bodies floating by are fresh and which are old. This is what survival looks like when childhood ends in a single catastrophic moment. Communication with the outside world is non-existent. No postal service, no telegrams, no way to know if help is coming, or if anyone even knows you're still alive. You exist in complete isolation, cut off from civilization as surely as if you'd been transported to an alien planet. The Chinese government, overwhelmed and largely ineffective, cannot reach you even if they wanted to. You are entirely on your own in a hostile environment that changes by the hour. The psychological toll is perhaps worse than the physical hardships. You are watching everything that defined your identity, your community, your culture, disappear beneath the waves. Ancient family graves are underwater. The temple where you were married is gone. The school where your children learned to read has been swept away. You are not just fighting for physical survival, you are watching the complete erasure of your world. Disease spreads through the survivor communities like wildfire. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all of them thrive in the contaminated water that surrounds you. People who survived the initial flooding are dying in droves from illnesses that would have been treatable under normal circumstances. You've seen entire families wiped out not by drowning, but by drinking the only water available. The cruel irony is that you were surrounded by water but dying of thirst, because every drop is potentially lethal. The social fabric of your community, built over generations, unravels with shocking speed. Neighbors who once shared everything now hoard scraps of food. Desperate parents abandon children they cannot feed. The elderly and sick are left behind when groups attempt to find higher ground. Civilization, you realize, is much more fragile than anyone imagined. It can be washed away just as easily as buildings and bridges. As night falls, and you huddle with your remaining family members on your steadily shrinking platform, you listen to the sounds of the flood. Somewhere in the darkness, someone is crying. Somewhere else, someone is praying. The water continues its relentless conversation with itself, gurgling, rushing, and occasionally punctuated by the crash of another structure surrendering to the current. You calculate, as you do every night, how much higher the water can rise before your shelter is completely submerged. You estimate how many more days your meager food supplies will last. You wonder if tomorrow will bring rescue, or if tomorrow will bring the end. These are the kinds of calculations no human being should have to make. But in July 1931, in the heart of China's worst natural disaster, they occupy every waking moment. You are not just fighting against water, you are fighting against time, against disease, against hunger, against despair, against the slow dissolution of everything that once made life worth living. You are learning that survival is not a heroic struggle, but a grim, exhausting, day-by-day battle against forces so vast and indifferent that your individual existence becomes almost meaningless. This is what it really meant to live through the 1931 China floods. Not a dramatic movie scene of heroic rescues and last-minute saves, but a grinding, dehumanizing ordeal that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. Most people, quite simply, did not pass that test. The lucky ones drowned quickly. The unlucky ones lived long enough to understand exactly how powerless human beings really are when the natural world decides to remind us of our place in the cosmic order. And somewhere in the back of your mind, as you drift into another fitful sleep, you cannot shake the terrifying knowledge that the water is still rising. The cruel mathematics of survival. Before we continue deeper into this catastrophic chapter of human history, let's pause for a moment to check in with our community. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? If you're truly finding value in these explorations of history's more sobering moments, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and consider subscribing to our channel. And please, drop a comment below. Let us know what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or simply check in and say hello. You're an important part of our growing community here, and I want to thank you for your continued support and for being part of our little corner of the internet. Now, back to the unforgiving reality of 1931 China, where survival had become a matter of cold, brutal mathematics. The water doesn't just take your home and possessions, it takes your humanity piece by piece. By August, you've been forced to make calculations that would have been unthinkable just months before. How many calories does it take to keep a child alive for one more day? How much clean water can you spare for washing wounds when drinking water is scarce? Which family members are strong enough to justify sharing the last handful of grain? These aren't philosophical questions anymore. They're life and death equations that must be solved multiple times each day. You've watched strong men reduced to tears, not from the loss of their homes, but from having to choose which of their children gets the larger portion of food. The flood has turned everyone into unwilling accountants of survival, measuring life in ounces of rice and cups of murky water. The seasonal rhythms that once governed your existence have been completely obliterated. There is no planting season, no harvest, no New Year celebrations, no market days. Time is now measured only in the rising and falling of water levels, in the intervals between finding food and counting the days since you last saw another survivor. The ancient Chinese lunar calendar that guided your ancestors for millennia has become meaningless when every day brings the same struggle against drowning, starvation, and despair. Your hands, once calloused from honest farm work, are now torn and infected from building and rebuilding shelters, from grabbing at floating debris, from fishing with bare fingers in contaminated water. Every small injury becomes a potential death sentence in this environment where cleanliness is impossible and medical care non-existent. You've watched people die from infected splinters, from minor cuts that turned septic, from eating spoiled food because hunger overruled caution. The children who survive develop skills no child should need to know. They learn to identify the safest looking water by color and smell. They become expert at judging which pieces of floating debris might contain food and which might contain something worse. They master the art of absolute silence when adults are making decisions about rationing, understanding instinctively that their very survival might depend on not drawing attention to their own needs. Women face additional horrors in this aquatic wasteland. Privacy has become impossible when everyone lives on tiny platforms and makeshift rafts. Personal hygiene, already challenging for everyone, creates particular dangers for women in a world where weakness or illness can mean abandonment. Pregnancy, once celebrated, now represents a potential death sentence for both mother and child in an environment where adequate nutrition and basic medical care are fantasies. The elderly become the flood's most predictable victims, not just because of physical frailty, but because they often choose to sacrifice their own survival for younger family members. You've witnessed grandparents quietly slipping away in the night, not from drowning or disease, but from simply giving up their share of food and water until their bodies could no longer function. These silent martyrs receive no ceremonies, no proper burials, only the endless anonymity of brown water. The psychological adaptation required for survival changes people in fundamental ways. You find yourself becoming emotionally numb to sights that would have horrified you months ago. Dead bodies floating past barely register anymore. The crying of hungry children becomes background noise. You develop a kind of selective blindness, focusing only on immediate survival tasks, while mentally blocking out the larger catastrophe surrounding you. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all is how quickly human beings can adapt to the unthinkable. What seemed impossible to endure in the first weeks has become routine by month 3. You've developed new skills, new instincts, new ways of thinking that are perfectly suited to this apocalyptic environment. Part of you realizes that even if rescue comes tomorrow, you will never again be the same person who planted rice in the spring of 1931. The flood has not just changed the landscape, it has fundamentally altered everyone who survived it. This is the true legacy of the 1931 China floods, beyond the statistics and casualty numbers. It represents one of history's most extreme examples of human adaptability in the face of absolute catastrophe, and a sobering reminder that civilization's veneer of safety and predictability can be stripped away with terrifying speed by forces entirely beyond human control. The unlikely hero, Li Siguang, and the race against geological catastrophe. As we transition from the intimate horror of survival to the broader canvas of this disaster, we encounter a figure whose story reads like something from an adventure novel, yet every detail is grimly true. Meet Li Siguang, a geologist whose name should be as famous as any war hero. For he fought a battle against nature itself with nothing but scientific knowledge and unwavering determination. Li Siguang was not supposed to be China's geological savior. Born in 1889 to a poor family in Hubei province, the very region that would later become ground zero for the catastrophic floods, he seemed destined for obscurity. His father, a village teacher, could barely afford to send him to school. Yet by 1931, this humble scholar had become one of China's most respected earth scientists, and more importantly, one of the few people in the entire country who truly understood what was happening beneath the surface of this unfolding catastrophe. In the early months of 1931, while most of China's leadership was focused on political upheavals and military conflicts, Li Siguang was studying seismographic readings and geological surveys that painted a terrifying picture. The earthquake activity along the Yangtze River basin had increased dramatically over the previous 18 months. Underground water tables were shifting in ways he'd never seen before. Most ominously, the riverbed elevations were changing, suggesting that the earth itself was reshaping the drainage patterns of central China. What Li Siguang realized, with growing alarm, was that China was not simply experiencing unusually heavy rainfall. The country was witnessing a geological event that occurred perhaps once every 1,000 years. A perfect storm of seismic activity, climate patterns, and human intervention that was creating conditions for a flood of biblical proportions. The problem was convincing anyone in authority to listen to him. The Chinese government in 1931 was hardly equipped to handle routine administrative tasks. let alone respond to warnings about theoretical geological catastrophes. The country was fractured by civil war, with various warlords controlling different regions. While the central government, under Chiang Kai-shek, was more concerned with consolidating political power than investing in scientific infrastructure, Li Siguang found himself in the impossible position of possessing crucial knowledge that could save millions of lives while lacking any meaningful way to act on that knowledge. His first attempts to raise alarm were met with polite dismissal. Government officials, when they bothered to meet with him at all, viewed his warnings as academic speculation. Military commanders were too busy fighting each other to worry about theoretical floods. Even his fellow scientists, many of whom had been trained in traditional methods that emphasized observation over prediction, were skeptical of his more dramatic forecasts. But Li Siguang was not a man easily deterred. As the spring rains of 1931 began earlier and heavier than usual, he embarked on what can only be described as a one-man crusade to document and predict the unfolding disaster. Working with a budget that barely covered his travel expenses, he began a systematic survey of the Yangtze River system that would prove to be both heroic and heartbreaking, traveling by foot, bicycle, and occasionally donated mule. Li Siguang covered over 3,000 miles. During the spring and early summer of 1931, he took soil samples from riverbanks that were already showing signs of dangerous erosion. He measured water flow rates at dozens of locations along tributaries that were running far higher than historical norms. Most importantly, he interviewed hundreds of local residents, particularly elderly farmers whose memories stretched back decades, gathering oral histories of previous flood patterns. What he discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The geological foundations of the Yangtze River basin were far more unstable than anyone had realized. Centuries of deforestation, combined with intensive agriculture and recent industrial development, had fundamentally altered the region's ability to absorb rainfall. The traditional flood control systems, some dating back over 1,000 years, had been designed for the China of previous centuries, not the environmentally degraded landscape of 1931. Li Siguang's field notes from this period, preserved in Chinese archives, read like dispatches from an approaching apocalypse. "The earth here has lost its memory," he wrote after examining severely eroded hillsides in Anhui province, where once the soil knew how to drink the sky's offerings. Now it can only watch helplessly as the water runs away to places where it was never meant to go. By early June, his measurements and calculations pointed to an unavoidable conclusion. If the heavy rains continued for just a few more weeks, the Yangtze River system would exceed its capacity by margins that would make previous floods look like minor inconveniences. He estimated that water levels could rise by as much as 40 feet above normal, creating temporary lakes larger than many countries. The tragedy of Li Siguang's story is not just that his warnings were ignored, but that when people finally began to listen, it was already too late for organized prevention efforts. By the time local officials started taking his measurements seriously, the disasters he had predicted were already beginning to unfold. His scientific accuracy became a source of anguish rather than vindication. As the floods began in earnest in July 1931, Li Siguang found himself in an impossible position. He possessed detailed knowledge of which areas would flood next and how severe the damage would be, but lacked the resources or authority to implement meaningful evacuation efforts. He became a reluctant prophet of doom, able to predict catastrophe with startling accuracy, but powerless to prevent it. Working with a small team of dedicated assistants, many of them his former students, Li Siguang established an unofficial early warning network. using telegraph lines when they were available and human messengers when they were not. He tried to provide advance notice to communities in the path of the expanding floods. His predictions were accurate to within hours in many cases. But even perfect prediction meant little when people had no means of escape. One of his most heartbreaking journal entries describes his experience in a village called Shishu in Hubei province. His calculations indicated that the town, built on what appeared to be high ground, would be completely submerged within 36 hours due to a convergence of floodwaters from 3 different river systems. Despite his warnings, most residents refused to leave, unable to believe that their supposedly safe location could be threatened. Li Siguang and his team spent an entire day moving from house to house, showing residents his maps and measurements, explaining in simple terms why their village was doomed. Some families listened and departed with whatever possessions they could carry. Others dismissed him as an alarmist outsider. When he returned a week later, Shishu was 20 feet underwater, and he never learned the fate of those who had chosen to stay. The psychological toll of being right about such terrible events began to wear on Li Siguang as the summer progressed. His correspondence with his wife reveals a man struggling with guilt and frustration. "I have become a messenger of endings," he wrote in August. "Every accurate prediction feels like a personal failure, evidence that I understood the problem but could not solve it." Yet Li Siguang's work during the 1931 floods established him as a pioneer in what we would now call disaster prediction and geological risk assessment. His methods for correlating geological surveys with meteorological data became the foundation for modern flood forecasting in China. His emphasis on combining scientific measurement with local knowledge revolutionized how earth scientists approach natural disaster research. Perhaps most importantly, Li Siguang's experience during 1931 taught him that scientific knowledge without institutional support is nearly useless in emergency situations. He spent the remainder of his career working to establish better connections between China's scientific community and its government infrastructure, recognizing that even perfect predictions are worthless if there's no system in place to act on them. The story of Li Siguang during the 1931 China floods represents one of history's most poignant examples of the tragedy that occurs when scientific understanding exists in isolation from political and social systems capable of responding to that understanding. He was the right person with the right knowledge at the right time. Yet the broader context made his expertise almost meaningless. As we continue our exploration of this catastrophic event, Li Siguang's story reminds us that natural disasters are never simply natural. They are always intersections of geological processes, human development patterns, political systems, and individual choices. Understanding the 1931 floods requires appreciating not just the power of water and weather, but the complex human systems that either amplified or mitigated nature's destructive potential, the personal cost of prophecy. What made Li Siguang's ordeal even more devastating was the deeply personal nature of his connection to the disaster zone. This was not some distant region he was studying from an academic perspective. This was his homeland. The villages being swallowed by the floods were places where he had played as a child. The farmers who refused to heed his warnings spoke in the same dialect he had learned at his mother's knee. Every accurate prediction felt like watching his own memories disappear beneath the brown water. His personal correspondence during this period reveals the profound emotional toll of his position. In a letter to his brother, written in late July as the floods reached their peak, Li Siguang described a recurring nightmare. "I dream that I am standing on a mountaintop, shouting warnings to people in the valley below, but my voice makes no sound. I can see the water coming. I know exactly when it will arrive and how high it will rise. But I am mute. I wake up hoarse, as if I had actually been screaming. The isolation of his expertise became a form of psychological torture. Li Siguang possessed knowledge that could have saved thousands of lives if properly implemented. Yet he was forced to watch helplessly as his predictions came true with horrifying accuracy. He began keeping what he called his Book of Sorrows, a detailed record of every community he had tried to warn, noting which ones heeded his advice and which ones perished in the floods. The book, discovered decades later among his papers, makes for devastating reading. One entry, dated August 15th, 1931, describes his return to a fishing village along the Han River, where he had spent 3 days in June trying to convince residents to relocate their boats and valuables to higher ground. His geological surveys had indicated that this particular stretch of river would experience a surge that would overtop the traditional flood barriers by at least 12 feet. The village headman had dismissed him as a city-educated troublemaker who didn't understand local conditions. "Today I returned to Hegu village," Li Siguang wrote. "It no longer exists, where 400 people lived and worked for generations. There is now only open water and the tops of a few sturdy trees. I found one of the boats I had urged them to move, broken apart and wrapped around a telegraph pole 2 miles from where it should have been. The headman who argued with me about flood patterns is somewhere beneath 20 feet of water, proven definitively wrong by the laws of physics and hydrology." The psychological burden of such experiences began to manifest in physical symptoms. Li Siguang's assistants noted that he developed a persistent tremor in his hands during the worst months of the flooding. He lost significant weight despite the irregular but adequate meals his position afforded him. Most telling, he began exhibiting what we might now recognize as symptoms of survivor's guilt, constantly questioning whether he could have communicated his warnings more effectively or found ways to force authorities to take action. His scientific methodology, ironically, made his emotional suffering worse. Li Siguang's training had taught him to document everything meticulously, to maintain detailed records, to verify and cross-reference his observations. This meant he possessed precise records of his failed attempts to save lives. He knew exactly how many people he had spoken to in each doomed community, could calculate with mathematical precision how many deaths might have been prevented if his warnings had been heeded. The broader scientific community's reaction to Li Siguang's work added another layer of professional isolation to his personal anguish. Many of his colleagues, particularly those educated in Western institutions, viewed his integration of local knowledge with geological science as insufficiently rigorous. They criticized his reliance on interviews with elderly farmers and his use of oral histories to supplement his quantitative measurements. This academic skepticism persisted even as his predictions proved startlingly accurate. Li Siguang found himself caught between 2 worlds, neither of which fully accepted him. Government officials dismissed him as an impractical academic whose theories had no bearing on real-world policy decisions. Fellow scientists questioned his methods and suggested he was abandoning proper scientific objectivity by becoming emotionally invested in disaster prevention. The farmers and villagers he was trying to help often viewed him with suspicion as an educated outsider who didn't truly understand their local conditions. This professional isolation had profound implications for China's long-term disaster preparedness. Li Siguang's hybrid approach, combining rigorous scientific measurement with deep local knowledge, represented exactly the kind of interdisciplinary thinking needed to address complex environmental challenges. Yet because his methods didn't fit neatly into existing academic categories, and because his results threatened established political and social assumptions, his innovations were largely ignored by the institutions that should have embraced them. The international scientific community was even less helpful. Foreign geologists and hydrologists, when they paid attention to Chinese natural disasters at all, tended to focus on the exotic or sensational aspects rather than the underlying scientific principles. Li Siguang's detailed analyses of riverbed composition and seasonal flood patterns were dismissed as locally specific curiosities rather than contributions to global understanding of geological processes. Perhaps most frustrating for Li Siguang was watching foreign journalists and relief workers arrive after the disaster with predetermined narratives about Chinese backwardness and inevitable tragedy. These outside observers showed little interest in understanding the scientific factors that had made the floods so severe, or in learning from Chinese expertise about managing such disasters in the future. They treated the catastrophe as confirmation of Western assumptions about Chinese environmental management, rather than as an opportunity for international scientific collaboration. Li Siguang's journals from the autumn of 1931, as the floodwaters finally began to recede, reveal a man grappling with profound questions about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. Is it worse to possess understanding that proves useless, or to remain ignorant and therefore blameless? He wrote. I envy the farmers who could not have known what was coming. Their grief is pure, uncomplicated by the knowledge that much of their suffering was preventable. The aftermath of the floods brought Li Siguang a kind of bitter vindication. Government officials who had dismissed his warnings suddenly wanted detailed briefings on his predictive methods. International scientific organizations, previously uninterested in Chinese geological research, began requesting copies of his flood studies. Universities that had questioned his academic rigor now sought to recruit him for prestigious positions. Yet this belated recognition felt hollow to Li Siguang. Recognition after catastrophe, he realized, was worse than useless. It was a form of institutional amnesia that allowed everyone to pretend they had taken the science seriously all along. In his private correspondence, he expressed deep skepticism about whether China's political and academic institutions would actually learn from the disaster or simply move on to other concerns once the immediate crisis passed. This skepticism would prove prophetic. Despite the unprecedented scale of the 1931 floods and Li Siguang's documented success in predicting their severity, China's investment in geological disaster preparation remained minimal for decades. The same institutional failures that had rendered his expertise useless during the crisis continued to hamper disaster preparedness efforts long after the floodwaters receded. Li Siguang's story during the 1931 floods thus represents not just individual heroism in the face of natural disaster, but a case study in how societies fail to integrate scientific knowledge into decision-making processes, even when the consequences of that failure are measured in millions of lives. In our next segment, we'll explore the mysteries and archaeological significance of what the floodwaters revealed when they finally receded, uncovering secrets that had been buried for centuries and providing unexpected insights into China's ancient past. Secrets beneath the waters. The archaeological mysteries revealed by catastrophe, as devastating as the 1931 floods were for the living. They performed an unintended service for historians and archaeologists that wouldn't be fully appreciated until decades later, when the waters finally receded in late 1931 and early 1932. They left behind not just mud and debris, but exposed secrets that had been buried beneath Chinese soil for over 2 millennia. The floods had essentially performed the largest archaeological excavation in human history, though nobody realized it at the time. The first hints of these hidden treasures came from the most mundane of sources: farmers trying to reclaim their land. As survivors returned to assess the damage to their fields and villages, they began finding objects that clearly didn't belong to their own time. Bronze vessels emerged from newly carved gullies. Stone tablets bearing ancient inscriptions lay scattered across rice paddies. Most intriguingly, the flooding had exposed what appeared to be the foundations of structures far older and more sophisticated than anything that should have existed in these rural areas. The mystery deepened when local authorities, overwhelmed with the basic tasks of disaster recovery, began receiving reports from dozens of locations across the flood zone. Farmers were uncovering elaborate burial sites, complete with jade ornaments and bronze weapons. Construction workers, attempting to rebuild bridges and roads, found themselves excavating through layers of artifacts that suggested continuous human habitation stretching back thousands of years. Most puzzling of all, the flood damage had revealed extensive networks of ancient canals and drainage systems that appeared to be far more sophisticated than the flood control infrastructure that had just failed so catastrophically. What nobody understood in those chaotic months of 1932 was that the Yangtze River basin contained one of archaeology's greatest unsolved puzzles, a mystery that would challenge fundamental assumptions about the development of Chinese civilization. The floods had accidentally uncovered evidence of what scholars would later term the Sangxingdui culture, an advanced Bronze Age civilization that had flourished in the very regions most devastated by the disaster, yet had somehow been completely forgotten by historical records. The first systematic investigation of these flood-revealed sites didn't begin until 1934, when Dr. Wang Xiaozang, an archaeologist from Beijing University, finally managed to organize a proper expedition to catalogue the discoveries. What he found defied easy explanation. The artifacts emerging from the flood zones showed clear evidence of a highly sophisticated society that had existed during China's Bronze Age, roughly contemporaneous with the famous Shang dynasty, yet exhibiting cultural characteristics that seemed completely alien to known Chinese traditions. The bronze work was perhaps the most striking evidence of this lost civilization's sophistication. Pieces recovered from flood sites displayed metalworking techniques that weren't supposed to have existed in ancient China. Massive bronze masks, some over 3 feet tall, featured bulging eyes and elaborate decorative patterns that bore no resemblance to any known Chinese artistic tradition. Bronze trees, intricately crafted with dozens of branches supporting tiny birds and fruit, suggested religious or ceremonial purposes that historians couldn't begin to interpret. Even more mysterious were the jade artifacts scattered across the floodplain. These weren't the simple ornamental pieces typically associated with ancient Chinese burial sites. Instead, flood survivors were finding elaborate jade ceremonial weapons, circular discs with mysterious symbolic carvings, and human figurines displaying clothing and hairstyles that seemed to belong to an entirely different cultural tradition. The jade itself was of exceptionally high quality, requiring mining and crafting techniques that suggested extensive trade networks and specialized artisan classes. The architectural evidence was equally puzzling. Flood damage had revealed foundations for structures, built using construction techniques that didn't match any known Chinese building methods. Stone foundations showed evidence of sophisticated drainage systems and what appeared to be advanced understanding of engineering principles. Some buildings had clearly been constructed on massive raised platforms, suggesting that this ancient civilization had faced their own challenges with periodic flooding and had developed remarkably effective solutions. Perhaps most intriguingly, The flood excavations had uncovered what appeared to be an ancient writing system that bore no resemblance to the evolution of Chinese characters. Stone tablets and bronze vessels displayed intricate, symbolic systems that seemed to represent a completely independent development of written language. The symbols combined pictographic elements with what appeared to be phonetic components, suggesting a level of linguistic sophistication that challenged assumptions about the development of writing in ancient Asia. Dr. Wang's initial reports, published in 1935, caused considerable controversy within Chinese academic circles. The artifacts he described seemed to suggest the existence of an advanced civilization that had somehow been completely omitted from traditional Chinese historical narratives. This was particularly problematic because the sites were located in regions that were supposedly well documented in ancient texts. How could such an sophisticated society have existed without leaving any trace in historical records? The mystery deepened when carbon dating techniques, though primitive by modern standards, began to provide dates for the flood-revealed artifacts. The results suggested that this unknown civilization had flourished during the same period when traditional Chinese histories described these regions as sparsely populated frontier areas. Either the historical records were incomplete, or this advanced society had developed in complete isolation from the better documented civilizations of ancient China. Religious and ceremonial aspects of the artifacts provided additional puzzles. Many of the bronze and jade pieces showed clear evidence of ritual use, but the religious symbolism was unlike anything found in traditional Chinese archaeological sites. The recurring motifs of trees, birds, and celestial symbols suggested a cosmology that emphasized connections between earth and sky, but in ways that didn't correspond to known Chinese religious traditions. The burial practices revealed by the flood damage were equally mysterious. The exposed grave sites showed evidence of elaborate funeral rituals involving the sacrifice of valuable objects, but also what appeared to be human sacrifice on a scale that exceeded anything documented in contemporary Chinese sites. Some burial chambers contained dozens of bronze weapons and ceremonial objects, suggesting a highly stratified society with considerable wealth disparities. Trade relationships evidenced by the artifacts raised additional questions about the extent and sophistication of this lost civilization. Raw materials for many of the bronze and jade pieces had clearly come from regions hundreds of miles away, indicating extensive trade networks. Some artifacts showed influences from cultures as distant as Central Asia and Southeast Asia, suggesting that this supposedly isolated civilization had actually been part of far-reaching cultural and economic exchanges. The agricultural evidence uncovered by the floods provided perhaps the most practical insights into this vanished society. The revealed irrigation systems were far more sophisticated than anything documented from the same historical period in China. Ancient field boundaries showed evidence of crop rotation techniques and water management strategies that wouldn't be invented in Chinese agriculture for several more centuries, according to traditional historical accounts. Most tantalizingly, some of the flood-exposed sites showed evidence of astronomical observation and recording. Stone circles and aligned markers suggested that this civilization had developed sophisticated methods for tracking seasonal changes and celestial events. Some scholars speculated that these astronomical capabilities might have enabled more accurate flood prediction and agricultural planning than had been available to the farmers devastated by the 1931 disaster. The technological sophistication evidenced by the flood-revealed artifacts extended beyond metalworking and agriculture. Ceramic fragments showed evidence of kilns, capable of reaching temperatures that weren't achieved elsewhere in China until much later periods. Glass beads and ornaments indicated knowledge of glass-making techniques that traditional histories didn't associate with ancient China at all. As Dr. Wang and his colleagues continued their investigations throughout the 1930s, they began to realize that the 1931 floods had revealed evidence of what might have been China's first truly advanced civilization, predating the well-documented dynasties by centuries and possibly representing an entirely independent path of cultural development. The implications for understanding Chinese history were staggering. Yet the timing of these discoveries created their own tragedy. Just as archaeologists were beginning to understand the significance of what the floods had revealed, China was plunged into war with Japan, followed by civil war and revolution. The systematic study of these mysterious sites was abandoned for decades, and many of the most important artifacts disappeared during the chaos of the war years. The scattered survivors of the 1931 floods, struggling to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of catastrophe, had unknowingly walked across the remains of a lost civilization that might have held keys to understanding humanity's earliest experiments with complex society. They had lived through not just one of history's worst natural disasters, but also one of its most significant accidental archaeological discoveries. The mystery of this flood-revealed civilization would remain largely ignored until the 1980s, when renewed archaeological interest would finally begin to unlock the secrets that the 1931 catastrophe had exposed. But that's a story for another time, as we now turn our attention to a different aspect of this remarkable disaster: how China's wealthy elite experienced these same catastrophic months from their very different perspective. The vanished voices of ancient wisdom. What makes the flood-revealed archaeological discoveries even more haunting is the realization that this advanced civilization had developed sophisticated flood management techniques that might have prevented or mitigated the 1931 disaster. The ancient drainage systems exposed by the catastrophe showed evidence of engineering principles that the modern Chinese government had apparently forgotten or never learned. Dr. Wang's field notes from 1936 contain a particularly poignant observation. While examining an exposed section of ancient canal network near what had been the village of Tianmen, he realized that the 1,000-year-old waterway had been designed with overflow channels and retention basins that would have directed excess water away from populated areas. The system showed clear evidence of mathematical precision in calculating water flow rates and seasonal variation patterns. It is as if our ancestors possessed knowledge that we have lost, Wang wrote. These people, whose names we do not know and whose language we cannot read, understood the temperament of these rivers better than our contemporary engineers. They built for floods that would not come for centuries, while we built for convenience and ignored the warnings written in stone beneath our feet. The irony was devastating. The same areas where millions of people had suffered and died in 1931 contained evidence of ancient flood control systems that had apparently protected previous generations for hundreds of years. The sophisticated civilization revealed by the floods had not just coexisted with the volatile Yangtze River system. They had developed technologies and strategies for managing its destructive potential. Archaeological evidence suggested that this lost civilization had experienced their own catastrophic floods, but had learned from them in ways that 1930s China had not. Successive layers of construction showed how ancient builders had repeatedly modified and improved their flood defenses over generations. Each disaster had apparently led to better engineering rather than simple reconstruction of failed systems. The astronomical observation sites revealed by the floods provided additional evidence of long-term planning that was absent from modern Chinese flood management. Stone circles and celestial markers suggested that ancient astronomers had developed methods for predicting seasonal weather patterns with remarkable accuracy. Some researchers speculated that this lost civilization might have possessed flood prediction capabilities that exceeded anything available to Li Siguang and his contemporaries. Perhaps most fascinating were the ancient texts that occasionally emerged from flood-damaged burial sites, though the writing system remained undeciphered. Some tablets clearly contained numerical sequences and diagrams that appeared to be engineering specifications. Dr. Wang's team found several bronze plates covered with symbols that seemed to represent water flow calculations and construction measurements, suggesting that this civilization had developed written technical manuals for flood management. The agricultural terracing systems exposed by the floods showed evidence of soil conservation techniques that addressed one of the root causes of the 1931 disaster. Ancient farmers had apparently understood that preventing erosion in highland areas was crucial for managing flood risks in river valleys. Their terracing methods, revealed by flood damage, showed mathematical precision in calculating optimal angles and drainage patterns that wouldn't be matched by Chinese agriculture until the late 20th century. Trade artifacts found at flood-revealed sites indicated that this ancient civilization had maintained exchange relationships with mountain communities specifically for obtaining materials needed for flood defense construction. Bronze tools and jade ornaments showed clear evidence of specialized craftsmanship devoted to water management infrastructure, suggesting that flood prevention had been a central organizing principle of their entire economy. The religious and ceremonial aspects of flood management were perhaps the most intriguing discovery. Many of the bronze ritual vessels showed water-related imagery and seemed designed for ceremonies related to seasonal flooding. This suggested that the ancient civilization had developed cultural practices that helped communities prepare psychologically and practically for periodic disasters, rather than being surprised by them as 1930s China had been. Some burial sites revealed what appeared to be specialized flood prediction priesthoods, with grave goods including bronze astronomical instruments and jade tablets covered with what seemed to be seasonal calendars. These religious specialists apparently held responsibility for warning communities about approaching flood seasons and coordinating preparatory activities. The social organization revealed by flood-exposed archaeological sites suggested a civilization that had made flood management a central governmental function. Large ceremonial sites seemed designed for community gatherings focused on disaster preparation. Storage facilities showed evidence of systematic stockpiling of food and materials for emergency use, indicating institutional planning that exceeded anything available to 1931 flood victims. Most remarkably, some of the ancient sites showed evidence of deliberate, controlled flooding techniques. Certain areas had apparently been designed to be temporarily inundated during peak flood seasons, with population centers built on elevated platforms that remained safe while surrounding agricultural areas absorbed excess water. This represented a fundamentally different approach to flood management, working with natural patterns rather than attempting to prevent them entirely. The architectural evidence suggested that this lost civilization had developed building techniques specifically adapted to periodic flooding. Foundation systems were designed to withstand temporary submersion without structural damage. Construction materials and methods showed clear adaptation to wet conditions that periodically affected the region. Yet perhaps the most sobering realization was that all of this sophisticated knowledge had been lost. The civilization that had developed these remarkable flood management capabilities had disappeared, so completely that no trace of their techniques survived in Chinese cultural memory. Whatever catastrophe had ended their society, whether natural disaster, warfare, or gradual decline, had taken with it centuries of accumulated wisdom about living safely in the Yangtze River basin. Dr. Wang's final report on the flood revealed archaeological sites, completed in 1940 just as Japanese invasion made further research impossible, concluded with a haunting observation. We have discovered a civilization that solved the very problems that continue to destroy us. In seeking to understand our past, we have found a future that we lost before we knew we needed it. When heaven's mandate failed, how China's elite weathered the storm, while millions of peasants struggled for survival in the floodwaters. China's wealthy elite experienced the 1931 catastrophe from a perspective so different it might as well have been happening on another planet. Their story reveals not just the stark inequalities of Chinese society, but also how the floods ultimately challenged the very foundations of traditional Chinese governance and social order. In the foreign concessions of Shanghai, barely 200 miles from some of the worst flooding, wealthy Chinese merchants and foreign businessmen continued their routines with remarkable normalcy throughout the summer of 1931. The international settlement, protected by modern drainage systems and elevated above flood level, remained largely untouched by the catastrophe that was reshaping the Chinese countryside. Here, in air-conditioned clubs and elegant mansions, the disaster existed primarily as a topic of dinner conversation and an opportunity for charitable photography. The contrast could not have been more stark. While farmers in Hubei province were calculating which family members had the best chance of survival, Shanghai's elite were debating whether the floods might actually benefit the silk trade by eliminating competing cotton production. While Li Siguang desperately tried to warn rural communities about approaching floodwaters, foreign businessmen in Shanghai were discussing investment opportunities in post-flood reconstruction projects. The Sung family, one of China's most powerful political dynasties, exemplified this disconnected elite perspective, while ordinary Chinese were dying by the thousands just days away from Shanghai. The Songs hosted elaborate dinner parties throughout the summer of 1931, complete with imported champagne and 7-course meals prepared by French chefs. Their correspondence from this period, preserved in family archives, reveals a remarkable ability to discuss the floods as abstract economic phenomena rather than human catastrophes. The water situation in the interior provinces may actually work to our advantage, wrote TV Sung, then serving as China's finance minister, in a letter to his sister. Cotton prices are rising, and our textile investments should see excellent returns. The reconstruction efforts will require significant government borrowing, which our banking interests are well positioned to facilitate. This perspective was typical of China's westernized elite, who had become accustomed to viewing their country's problems through the lens of international markets and foreign investment opportunities. The floods represented not human tragedy, but economic volatility that could be managed through proper financial planning and political connections. The traditional Chinese elite, represented by old Mandarin families and provincial warlords, had their own methods for insulating themselves from the disaster. In cities like Nanjing and Wuhan, wealthy households had maintained private food stores and transportation arrangements that allowed them to weather the floods in considerable comfort. Their large traditional compounds, built with courtyard designs that had evolved over centuries, often included elevated storage areas and private wells that provided security against temporary disruptions. More importantly, the traditional elite possessed something that money alone could not buy: social networks that provided early warning and preferential treatment during emergencies. While ordinary citizens waited for government relief that rarely came, wealthy families received advance notice of food distributions, priority access to transportation, and private security arrangements that protected their property from looters and desperate survivors. The provincial governors and military commanders, who controlled different regions of flood-ravaged China, faced a particularly complex challenge. They needed to balance their own survival and enrichment against the political necessity of appearing to respond effectively to the disaster. Their solutions reveal both the possibilities and limitations of elite power during genuine crises. General Zhong Fakui, who controlled significant territory in Hubei province at the heart of the flood zone, exemplified this delicate balancing act. While publicly calling for national solidarity and emergency assistance, Zhong privately focused on protecting his personal wealth and maintaining control over his most valuable territories. His military forces were deployed not primarily for flood relief, but to secure strategic locations and prevent rival warlords from taking advantage of the chaos. Zhang's headquarters in Wuhan, elevated above flood level and provisioned with months of supplies, became a small island of luxury surrounded by unprecedented suffering. Foreign visitors to his compound during the height of the floods described elaborate banquets and entertainment, while refugees crowded outside the gates. Zhong justified this apparent callousness as necessary for maintaining the authority needed to coordinate relief efforts. But his private papers reveal more concern with personal financial arrangements than disaster response. The intellectual elite, China's scholars and university professors, developed yet another approach to coping with the floods. Unable to match the raw economic power of merchants or the political authority of military leaders, they retreated into academic discussion and theoretical analysis that allowed them to feel engaged with the crisis while avoiding its practical demands. Professor Hu Xi, one of China's most prominent intellectuals, spent the summer of 1931 writing extensively about the flood's significance for Chinese modernization and cultural development. His essays, published in influential literary journals, treated the disaster as confirmation of his theories about China's need for Western-style scientific rationalism. While farmers were drowning in the provinces, Professor Hu was constructing elaborate philosophical arguments about how the floods proved the superiority of modern over traditional approaches to governance. This intellectual response to the disaster reflected a broader pattern among China's educated elite: the tendency to transform immediate human suffering into abstract discussions about long-term cultural and political development. University seminars throughout the summer of 1931 featured lengthy debates about the flood's implications for Chinese identity, modernization theory, and comparative studies of disaster response in different societies. The actual mechanics of rescue and relief were left to others. The foreign community in China, though not technically Chinese elite, wielded influence comparable to the wealthiest native families and developed their own distinctive approach to the flood crisis. Foreign businesses, missionary organizations, and diplomatic communities had resources and international connections that could have been invaluable for relief efforts. But their response was shaped by complex calculations about their long-term interests in China. The Standard Oil Company, which had extensive operations in the Yangtze River region, lost significant infrastructure to the floods, but viewed the disaster primarily as a temporary setback rather than a humanitarian crisis. Company records from 1931 showed detailed planning for post-flood reconstruction of facilities, but minimal investment in immediate relief for Chinese communities that had been devastated by the same floodwaters that damaged Standard Oil property. Christian missionary organizations represented a partial exception to elite indifference, but their response was complicated by their own institutional priorities and cultural assumptions. The China Inland Mission, one of the largest foreign religious organizations operating in the flood zone, provided significant relief assistance, but focused primarily on communities that showed potential for religious conversion, rather than areas of greatest need. Missionary reports from the flood zone reveal a perspective that combined genuine humanitarian concern with paternalistic assumptions about Chinese capabilities and foreign responsibilities. Relief efforts were organized around mission stations rather than population centers, and assistance was often conditional on participation in Christian worship services. The result was uneven aid distribution that reflected missionary priorities rather than disaster assessment. The most revealing aspect of elite response to the 1931 floods was how quickly the disaster exposed the limitations of traditional Chinese concepts of political legitimacy. For over 2 millennia, Chinese political philosophy had maintained that natural disasters reflected the loss of heaven's mandate by incompetent or immoral rulers. Floods, earthquakes, and famines were understood as cosmic signals that the existing government had lost the right to rule. The 1931 floods should have represented the ultimate test of this traditional concept. The disaster was unprecedented in scale and occurred at a time when China's government was already facing multiple challenges from civil war, foreign invasion, and economic instability. Traditional political theory would have predicted that such a catastrophe would trigger immediate governmental collapse as heaven's obvious withdrawal of support became undeniable. Instead, the floods revealed how thoroughly China's elite had abandoned traditional concepts of political responsibility, rather than viewing the disaster as evidence of their own moral or administrative failures. Both government officials and private elites treated it as an external event, requiring technical solutions rather than fundamental political reform. Chiang Kai-shek, nominally China's head of government, issued proclamations calling for national unity and promising comprehensive relief efforts. But his actual attention remained focused on military campaigns against communist forces and political maneuvering with rival warlords. The floods were treated as a distraction from more important political objectives rather than as evidence that the entire governmental system was fundamentally inadequate. This abandonment of traditional political responsibility had profound implications for how relief efforts were organized and funded. Instead of viewing disaster response as a core governmental function that justified temporary suspension of other activities, China's political elite treated flood relief as one competing priority among many others to be balanced against military spending, personal enrichment, and factional political struggles. The result was a response to the 1931 floods that was both inadequate in scale and corrupt in implementation. Government relief funds were diverted to private accounts. Military units assigned to disaster response were redeployed for political campaigns. International aid was intercepted and sold on black markets rather than distributed to flood victims. Perhaps most remarkably, many members of China's elite emerged from the 1931 floods wealthier and more powerful than before the disaster. Reconstruction contracts provided opportunities for enormous profits. Displaced populations created new labor markets that could be exploited at below subsistence wages. Agricultural land made temporarily worthless by flooding could be purchased cheaply and held until recovery restored its value. The wealthy Chinese merchant Chen Guangfu exemplified this opportunistic approach to disaster capitalism. Chen, who controlled significant banking and industrial interests in Shanghai, spent the flood months of 1931 purchasing bonds backed by agricultural land in the disaster zone. His calculation, proven correct, was that land values would eventually recover while providing enormous returns for those with sufficient capital to wait out the crisis. Chen's personal correspondence reveals a sophisticated understanding of how disasters create investment opportunities for those with adequate resources and risk tolerance. Every catastrophe redistributes wealth from those who cannot wait to those who can. He wrote to a business partner in August 1931, "The floods will pass. but the economic advantages they create for prepared investors will last for decades. This elite opportunism had lasting consequences for Chinese society that extended far beyond the immediate flood crisis. The 1931 disaster demonstrated that China's wealthy classes were not just insulated from natural catastrophes, but actually positioned to benefit from the suffering of ordinary citizens. This realization contributed to growing popular support for revolutionary movements that promised to overturn the existing social order entirely. The Communist Party, though still relatively small in 1931, gained significant credibility by providing more effective disaster relief in areas under their control than the national government managed in its own territory. Mao Zedong's early writings about the floods emphasized the connection between natural disasters and social inequality, arguing that China's environmental problems could not be solved without fundamental changes in economic and political structures. The intellectual framework that would later justify communist revolution in China was significantly shaped by elite responses to the 1931 floods. The disaster provided powerful evidence that China's existing ruling classes were not just incompetent, but actively parasitical, enriching themselves through crises that devastated ordinary citizens. Yet the ultimate irony of elite behavior during the 1931 floods was that their short-term success in avoiding the disaster's immediate consequences ultimately undermined their long-term political survival. By demonstrating such complete disconnection from the suffering of ordinary Chinese people, the elite inadvertently created the conditions for their own eventual overthrow. The floods of 1931 thus marked not just an environmental catastrophe, but a crucial turning point in modern Chinese history. They revealed the moral bankruptcy of traditional Chinese elites and provided a preview of the social revolution that would transform China within 2 decades. As we reach the end of our journey through one of history's most devastating natural disasters, it's worth reflecting on what the 1931 China floods reveal about the relationship between human societies and the natural forces that shape our world. This was not simply a story about too much rain in the wrong places at the wrong time. It was a story about how geological processes, human development patterns, political systems, and social inequalities combined to transform a natural event into a human catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The floods killed more people than both world wars combined, yet they remain largely forgotten outside of China, overshadowed by the political conflicts and ideological struggles that dominated the 20th century. Perhaps this itself tells us something important about how we understand disaster and suffering, how we choose which tragedies to remember and which to forget. The individual stories we've explored tonight, from the desperate farmer calculating which family members might survive another day, to Li Siguang's frustrated attempts to warn communities that wouldn't listen, to the archaeological mysteries accidentally revealed by the receding waters, to the callous opportunism of China's elite, all remind us that natural disasters are never simply natural. They are always intersections of human choices, social structures, and environmental forces. The 1931 floods also offer sobering lessons for our contemporary world. Facing its own environmental challenges and social inequalities, the same patterns that made the 1931 disaster so devastating: deforestation, inadequate infrastructure, political corruption, social inequality, scientific knowledge disconnected from policy implementation, continue to shape how modern societies respond to natural threats. Perhaps most importantly, the story of the 1931 China floods reminds us that individual human beings, facing impossible circumstances with limited resources and no good options, are capable of remarkable endurance, adaptation, and occasionally even heroism. The millions of people who lived through these catastrophic months, who made daily decisions about survival and sacrifice, who maintained their humanity while their world dissolved around them, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, but as fellow human beings, who faced the ultimate test of what it means to be alive. As you settle into sleep tonight, comfortable in your dry bed, safe from the immediate threats of flood, famine, and social collapse, perhaps spare a thought for those who came before us, who survived disasters we can barely imagine, who rebuilt their lives from nothing, and who remind us that human resilience, while not infinite, can be far greater than we might ever want to discover. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of history's forgotten catastrophes. Sweet dreams, and remember, even the worst disasters eventually end, and life, somehow, finds a way to continue. Until next time, this has been another journey through the darker chapters of human history, where we find not just tragedy, but also the remarkable story of human endurance against impossible odds.